Welcome to IsraelNet.tv.
I'm going to give you just a minute to get settled. If the kids need a drink, or if you need a drink, you need to use the restroom, please go ahead. But I don't know if you understand this season or not. You know, it was written to us, you don't have any need that I write unto you concerning the times or the seasons, but I think we're a generation that maybe we don't know our times and our seasons. And right now we're in the season of Purim. And it's leading us up to Pesach, which we know is the first day for us. It's the first of our festivals. And we've been looking at the creation of the world and how that creation, that order had to be drawn forth out of chaos, out of darkness, over deep darkness. And so we're in a season right now of darkness. And if you don't believe that, look around. The audacity of the enemy to attack one of our own while he's praising and worshiping and dancing before the Lord. Tammy's been bitten by her own dog. I was nearly killed yesterday by a horse that I delivered with my own hands, and I have never seen her in such a state of panic as she was yesterday. Devin was nearly killed in a wreck a couple weeks ago. And I haven't talked to everyone, but I know that probably more of you, if you consider, you also can look back and see that the enemy has made a point of pursuing your physical body. Because there's spiritual things going on, right? There's spiritual darkness that we're struggling against. And it's beginning to manifest itself toward us. I mean, Jimmy's having surgery when he should be worshiping in here on Shabbat, when he should be resting in that joy of Messiah. He's after our physical bodies at this point. Why? To distract us. Because we've been talking about the festivals and how important it is to approach these festivals with a pure and a tender heart. And it says a little child shall lead them. Why does it say that? Have you ever seen a child excited about a festival? We grown-ups were a little hardened and a little callous and a little skeptical, and it's another Passover and we have to work out the details, and there's so much work, and the deacons have a lot of things to put together, and we get consumed with the work. And we forget the tenderness of our spirits, and that's what he's asking of us, to remain tender. So I want you to be on the alert between now and Passover, because what he will try to do is to strip you of the joy of your first love. Passover is our first love. It was written to a church at Ephesus, but it is written to the assemblies of Passover, that we are to guard our hearts, not to lose that first love between now and Passover. And he's trying to do it at this point through physical attacks and threats. We need to keep watch. We say we're Shomrei Shabbat, that we watch or we keep the Sabbath. Well, watching and keeping means we guard it. And it also means that we need to watch and keep one another lifted up in prayer. Because each one of us in our own way throughout the week is attacked. And if we're not lifting one another up in prayer, if we're not watching out for one another, then we give the enemy a foothold. So I'm just going to encourage you and exhort you, between now and Passover, lift one another up in prayer. Keep the Shabbat holy by keeping the people who assemble on Shabbat guarded and watched and protected, covered in prayers. Okay. Everybody settled now? Ready to go? I got a thumbs up from the front row. Okay. The Torah portion today is called Tetzaveh, and it means command. A commandment's not an option, it's a must. And the title I gave it was Until the End, because we will keep the commandments until the end. This congregation will. We are the olive branch, and we will keep the commandments until the end. For those who are watching on IsraelNet, the full Torah portion is Exodus 27:20 through 30:10, Ezekiel 43:10 through 27. I would also recommend, if you're going to sit down and study with the tape, that you read Job 38. It's very interesting. We read Psalm 148. We also read 1 Peter chapter 4, and I'll be reading extensively from the chapter of Revelation 14. And I appreciate, the kids reading from Revelation this morning. They didn't know what I was going to teach on, but it's actually going to help me that they've read that in advance. This is also part of a series for those listening by IsraelNet. If you didn't begin studying with us back with Bereshit in the beginning, there might be some things that don't add up. And there's also some foundational things that you need to know in order to understand what I'm about to say. Number one, you need to know what the festivals are. You need to know those 7 days. You also need to know the creation gospel. You need to know that Yeshua was slain from the foundation of the world, and that gospel was preached through each day of creation. And that's what we've been trying to connect all this with. Last week we looked at the 7 spirits of God and how they affect those 7 festival days, how they affect the creation days. These sorts of things have been kind of paving a road where I think we will end up at Pesach. And as we press on this road, I think we'll understand the seriousness of what we're doing and the life that's in what we did today. That this is our preservation, our ability to worship and to keep His commandments. So now we're going to move on to Tetzaveh, you shall command. And the name of this portion, you shall command, kind of hints at its theme, which is not just the ordination of the priesthood, but it's referring to a central role that the festival of Shavuot plays to the other times and seasons of prophecy because of its seat as the 4th lamp of the menorah. It's situated right in the very middle. That is the Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of Adonai, and from it branch off the other 6 spirits, the other 6 festival days, the other 6 creation days. It's the 4th festival of the Messiah on which the tribes of Israel received the commandments of Adonai to be a light to the nations. And that's why it seems like, this little 2-verse blurb about the menorah at the beginning of the Torah portion seems a little disconnected when we go on to realize it's all about the priesthood and the consecration of Aaron and his sons. But it really is connected, because it's pointing us to this whole ritual, and we do not have enough days in the year probably to look at the actual rituals and sacrifices and for us to see how they affirm and establish everything we've said so far. But we can look at this central light. It says in Exodus 27:20-21, and you shall charge the sons of Israel that they bring you clear oil of beaten olives for the light, to make a lamp burn continually. In the tent of meeting outside the veil, which is before the testimony, Aaron and his sons shall keep it in order. From evening to morning before the Lord, it shall be a perpetual statute throughout their generations for the sons of Israel. It's a perpetual light. At Shavuot, Israel received the commandments of God, which were to be a perpetual light to the nations. It took them from being a nation called out and singled out into a nation who were supposed to light up the entire world with the information they had just received. And it says these lamps of the menorah are to be kept in order at all times, throughout the generations. It's continual. That central lamp, the fourth one, which is Shavuot, was the fourth day of creation, on which the sun, the moon, and the stars were assigned the gospel of Adonai's festival seasons to rule them, it said. To rule those Moedim on the fourth day. Whatever we do in Yeshua's service, whether we are part of a Levitical priesthood, which I don't think anyone in here is, or whether we are part of a royal priesthood, which I know that we all are, we are to ensure that the lamps of the seasons are kept in order in our generation. That's our responsibility, to make sure that those lamps are lit continually. Those 7 festivals must be kept aflame continually. The gospel of creation must be kept alight continually in our lives. Why? Yeshua hints to us that knowing the festival seasons is a key that opens the end of days to our understanding. If you've ever read Revelation and wondered what in the world it was talking about, you always had the key. You had the key with your first Bible story. The first thing we should teach our children is what was created on each day of the week. There are 7 days, and they should know what was created in order, because the numbers are important. The numbers were assigned to each part of the creation. When we have that in our mind, then we have the keystone. I was asking Alan which movie it was we saw. It might have been an Indiana Jones movie where there was this stone, and it was used as a key. And once you had this stone, you could insert it and then turn it like a key, and then it opened up a whole treasure trove of information. The gospel of the creation days, is like your keystone, because embedded in that stone are also understandings of the festival seasons that were established on each of those days. And once you insert that into something like Revelation, it will turn the lock. And you can very easily walk in and see a beautiful treasure, or you can walk to your own destruction. Either way, it's how you approach it, whether you approach it with a spirit of obedience or of disobedience. Now, keeping in mind the symbols and the pictures of Shavuot, just try to go to Mount Sinai right now in your mind and think of all the pictures and symbols we know of Shavuot. Let's listen to these words from our Rabbi Yeshua. He says in Matthew 24:27, "For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, or wherever the body is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky." What day of creation is that? Sun, moon, stars. Somebody shout it out. The fourth day, which corresponds to which festival? Shavuot. These things are going to fall from the sky, and they will no longer give their light, he says. And the powers, there's a key word, the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and with great glory. Now you also need to, I did a message called 50,000 Degrees and Cloudy. This is continuing that as well. Coming on the clouds of the sky with power, Gevurah, which is the 5th day spirit, the spiritual power of Gevurah. We see that in the great glory on the 5th day, on Yom Teruah. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. There again is Yom Teruah. And they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the sky to the other. 4 winds is not an idle word. It's not an idle phrase. So in our mind, the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west. We're at Mount Sinai, right? The thunder and the lightning and the voices and so forth. We're at the season of Shavuot. The tribulation of those days he refers to, the tzara. Remember, we get tzara in the words Mitzrayim for Egypt. Israel was drawn out of that chaos. And it also refers to that city called Sartan, where the golden vessels were poured and molded between Sartan and Sukkot. So somewhere between tribulation and Sukkot, we're being prepared for an eternal temple. But we can't do it without the tribulation, or we're not cooked. We're not done. We're not prepared. Part of it's tribulation, part of it's Sukkot. Part of it's distress, part of it's joy. It says the tribulation, or the tzara of those days, is followed by an unnatural darkening of the sun, moon, and stars. Now, metaphorically, I believe what he's saying is that the lamp of Shavuot is going to be darkened to the tribes of the earth. Because it says, the nations of the earth are not going to know what's going on. He says that darkness is going to be the result of a darkening of understanding of the sun, moon, and stars. Well, we know what they are. They're Shavuot. It's the fourth day of creation that was set in place to rule our calendar. It sets our calendar. It's Adonai's calendar, not ours. It's Yeshua's calendar. It's not ours. He kept his calendar perfectly because he put it in place. He was that wisdom. Even though the world lives in darkness to the calendar of Yeshua, we are not. And what happens at the same time, he says, that the world lives in darkness to the fourth day of creation, which set our calendar in place, it says, messengers are sent forth from this time to gather the elect from the four winds into the clouds of the heavens with power and with great glory. So Shavuot is a turning point for those who follow the creation calendar, and it's a good turning point. Not for the nations of the earth who live in darkness to it, who don't know Passover from Easter, or Sukkot from Christmas. It's not a good turning point for them because they don't know what time it is. They're, as we said, lunatics. They're moon blind. They don't know the times and the festival seasons that were set in place on the fourth day of creation. But if we keep the commandments of Yeshua's calendar, the commandments of the Father, it says that this is a time of gathering. This day of Shavuot is a time that we will be gathered into the clouds. And we know that from previous study that those clouds represent clouds of witnesses, obedient witnesses to the commandments. And that spirit of power now, remember he said, I want you to tarry at Shavuot in Jerusalem until you receive power, gevura, from on high. There's something that you will need in order to continue to the next stage. And then we know that because that power of gevura is associated with the fifth day of creation, the creation of the birds of the sky who move on the winds of the earth, which is the spirits, the ruach, the spirits. Those birds of the air fly on those four currents, those four winds of the earth. So at that time it says the elect will be gathered. Shavuot is a turning point. And between then and Yom Teruah, there is a gathering into the clouds that takes place. Now, the church might call that the rapture, but I think they're a tad off on the Left Behind series. I don't think the rapture is as it has been advertised on TV. I think there's much more for us to understand about this gathering into the clouds. The fifth festival of Yom Teruah, which does correspond to the spirit of power, the winds and the vibrations begin to move in power. Sound is nothing more than a vibration, is that right? Is that how sound works? It's just how fast the air moves, or how it's constricted as it moves, or so forth, and that's how we get different sounds. So there's winds, there's spirits, there are vibrations in those spirits that begin to move in power between Shavuot and Yom Teruah. Now the angel confirms this season by mentioning a sign of Yom Teruah, a great trumpet. Okay, and we know that that's associated with the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah. And this might explain a very cryptic remark that Yeshua made. He says, where the corpse is, there will the vultures gather. Now, I looked that up in the Greek, and it's in a couple of places maybe a little bit different, but it seems to refer to the soma, which is the body. And the vultures could also be translated as eagles. Either way, it's a bird, right? And if we go back and we try body, like it is in another mention of the gospel, wherever the body is, there will the birds, eagles, vultures, whatever, gather. So maybe this little kind of cryptic remark that Yeshua makes concerning the gathering of the birds to the body is referring to this great trumpet time, when those currents of the air will begin to draw those birds in to the body. Wherever the vultures or the eagles gather, we are to look for a body. Now, what kind of body? A dead body or a living body? It does sound kind of ominous in the context because he's talking about tribulation. But let's compare this to another place where he uses the word soma for body. And he's using it at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In Luke 22:19 he says, "And when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" Key words there, my body, which is given for you, is a resurrected body. And he said, I want you to do this in remembrance of me. So if we compare that to what we've learned so far, we know that the bread that he's handing out, that he says it's his body, was unleavened bread. And he's handing it out during the Feast of Hag HaMatzah, which encompasses the first 3 feasts of Pesach. Pesach, unleavened bread, and the first fruits of the barley are all bundled in to that season. Now that word remembrance means something. That is not an idle word either. When we say remembrance or zikaron, we should think of a specific feast. In Vayikra, Leviticus 23:24, it says, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, you shall have a rest, a reminder, by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation." Same word, remembrance, zikaron. I want you to remember something. What Yeshua is demonstrating to his disciples is that partaking of his body of death, or his corpse, to sin at unleavened bread was connecting them to a future resurrection that was going to occur with the gathering of their own bodies to the body of Yeshua at Yom Teruah. And we know that the Feast of Trumpets alludes directly to the resurrection of the dead in Messiah. Yom Teruah was that 5th day of creation. The eagles of the sky began to fly at that time. And at that time again, the eagles of the sky will begin to be gathered to him in the clouds. At Yom Teruah, wherever Yeshua's body is, wherever that soma is, the eagles of the air will be gathered to him like clouds. The tribulation days of day 1, which is Pesach, day 2, Chag HaMatzah, and day 3, first fruits, will be followed by a menorah in the sky of Shavuot, the 4th day. Remember, Shavuot, the 4th day of creation, sun, moon, and stars. Never forget that. It's very important. They were created for light in the sky. And its sign, the number 4, is followed by that 5th day trumpets of Yom Teruah, that blowing, moving the vibrations, the air. And this vibration, he says, will gather in the faithful of the earth. So what the church is calling a rapture, Adonai calls Shavuot. This period between Shavuot and Yom Teruah, you either is or you ain't, apparently. And I can show you that in more detail in Revelation. He's calling it Shavuot, a day of gathering. And he says, he didn't tell his disciples, each of you gather in your own house until Shavuot, until this power comes upon you to carry out my gospel. He wants them to remain together as brothers and sisters in Messiah. And they were found at Shavuot, gathered together as brothers and sisters in Messiah, praying at the appointed time, the appointed festival, the 4th day of creation. They were gathered together. They were birds about to be released into the world on those spirits, those 4 winds. It's the calendar of Adonai to which we are, I hate to do this, but I'm going to do it, raptured. We are raptured at Shavuot. We are gathered, I think, is a better description of it. Why? Because we are commemorating, we are remembering the correct calendar. we are being obedient to Yeshua, who said, go to where you're supposed to be at Shavuot and stay there until you receive the power to continue to Yom Teruah. Do not try to observe the day of blowing in your own power. You'll get blown over. Because there's other spirits out there other than my own. There are other trumpets blowing other than my own. And you need to know the sound of the shofar, and you need to know the sound of the silver trumpets from on high. It should give you a definite understanding if you know my calendar. The power and the glory of Messiah's return corresponds with his last instructions to his disciples to remain in Jerusalem from unleavened bread until Shavuot, so that they would receive that power from on high. And it was going to strengthen them from the 4th until the 5th day of creation. From Shavuot until Yom Teruah. Now, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Revelation 14. I'm going to show you some interesting things in here. Starting with verse 1 in Revelation 14, let's see if we can obtain some more information about this period of tribulation, which seems to turn much worse, for the world at least, between Shavuot and Sukkot. John says, and I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion. He is our Passover Lamb. In fact, he retains that identity through the book of Revelation as the Passover Lamb. But also the Lamb that we read about today, which is perpetual, a perpetual offering. Behold the Lamb of God, probably not talking about the Passover Lamb. When John says that, he's probably referring to that tamid, that perpetual offering of the Lamb, morning and evening. Just like the lamps had to be maintained morning and evening so they would not go out, this lamb was offered morning and evening to show that he would always be the lamb. That light would never go out. That sacrifice would never be made of none effect. It would always be effective for those who believed in the Lamb. And we see him in Revelation as that tamid offering, that perpetual lamb. Standing on Mount Zion, which, as we read in Ezekiel today, is a holy mountain, and it is to remain holy. It is not to have mosques and things like that built on top of it. It is not to be tread underfoot by the Gentiles. Nevertheless, here we are. And with him, 144,000 having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. And the voice which I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. And no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. These are the ones who have not been defiled with women, for they have kept themselves chaste. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb, and no lie was found in their mouth. They are blameless. Now that sound of many waters and loud thunders and lightnings transports us to another mountain. Other than he's standing on Mount Zion. But which mountain do you think of when you think of thunder and lightning and loud voices? Mount Sinai. In our minds, we need to go there. Mount Sinai, where the Torah was given at Shavuot to the sound of hail, lightning, and thunder. And there was a consuming fire on top of that mountain. And we know that Moses set up 12 pillars up around that mountain, which represented the 12 tribes. And we can see this again in Revelation. Those tribes are represented by living stones, not just rock stones. There's 12,000 from each tribe as first fruits. So if the 10th is the first fruits, multiply that number of 144,000 and you get a more accurate figure of the entirety of that harvest. But these people are first fruits. The identity of the living stones of first fruits around Mount Zion is that they have not defiled themselves with women. And that alludes to practices of idolatry. If we read through the book of Revelation, we understand that immorality, adultery, and so forth, not keeping your vessel in sanctification and honor, is associated with idolatry. And so he says, whatever this is, whether it's literal adultery or fornication, or whether it is spiritual adultery and fornication, following other gods and other calendars, these 144,000 have not been defiled with a different calendar. They have not adulterated themselves with practices of idolatry. The first fruits is also indicative of the feast of first fruits of the wheat harvest, which is Shavuot. It is a feast of first fruits. The 3 pilgrimage feasts are all feasts where first fruits are offered. At the giving of the Torah at Shavuot, the elders of Israel, remember, they ate and they drank in the presence of Adonai. So, this passage also refers to those heavenly elders and 4 living creatures that corresponding, remember, upper fire, upper water, lower water, elders above, elders below. And this hints at the place of that 4th candlestick of the menorah, Shavuot, the 4th festival of 7. 4 living creatures, the number 4, Shavuot, 4th day of creation. It's the midpoint of the 7 festivals, and it accounts for this next verse. He says, "And I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. And he said with a loud voice, 'Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the springs of waters.'" Wow, we're going straight back to the creation week here. It says this angel is flying through the mid-heaven. He's at a midpoint with an eternal gospel. So let's think of the last instructions the Lamb gave to his disciples on earth. He said, "Go forth, teach all nations," immersing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But they were to teach all nations, every tribe and tongue, the gospel of Yeshua, the commandments of creation, the living Torah, until they received the power from on high, which we connected with Shavuot to Yom Teruah last week. They were to gather and they were to wait in Jerusalem, Mount Zion, until Shavuot. And we know that later in Acts chapter 2, this power of the 5th day arrived to connect them, to strengthen them forward to the 5th day. It came in the form of what looked like cloven tongues of fire. And it says it rested upon each of them, and they were able to supernaturally speak in the tongues of the nations. And they were able to preach the gospel of Messiah, that creation gospel, to people in all sorts of languages. And it even says in Jewish tradition, at the original Shavuot, at the original Acts chapter 2, that the 70 nations of the earth were actually offered the commandments of the Torah, each in its own tongue. But out of all those nations of 70, at that first Shavuot, or at least the first one we can identify as Shavuot, if we disregard the 4th day of creation, only one nation said, "We will do and we will obey." And that just happened to be the nation of Israel. That nation called to be a lamp to the other nations, but each in its own tongue. So each nation hears this gospel in its own tongue. Now this angel refers to 3 things in that very brief message to every nation, tribe, and tongue. First, he says, fear God. And that's never bad advice. But this is that spirit of fear or reverence we connected with Sukkot last week. Number 2, he says, give to God glory, which is connected with Yom Teruah, the day of the awakening blast, in which Yeshua gathers in these clouds of witnesses into his glory, or his kavod. In fact, in our Torah portion, if we had read more of it, we would have found that the garments of the priests were for beauty, tiferet, and for glory, kavod. That's what those garments were, for beauty, tiferet, and glory, kavod. We can connect those priests' garments, if we had time, to the times and the seasons. Each part of what they were to put on each day connected them to the creation gospel. But we don't have time. Number 3, the angel says that the hour of judgment has come, and that we are to worship him who made heaven, earth, sea, and springs of waters. By this phrase, the angel is referring to 3 different festivals, or days of creation, that are preceding Shavuot, Pesach, unleavened bread, and the first fruits of the barley corresponding to the first 3 days of creation in which the heaven, the earth, the seas, and the gatherings of the waters were established. That's what he's referring to there. He's saying it might be the end, but I'm pointing you straight back to the beginning, the first thing you ever learned in the book of Genesis. I'm referring you back to these pilgrimage festivals. And he refers to that creation in past tense, but now he's talking about it in terms of a future judgment, something that is about to occur. We know that this time of judgment refers to that 10-day period between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur. And during that time, we run around and we tell each other, may your name be inscribed in the book of life. Why? Because it's a period of judgment. These are the days of awe that he's referring to between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur. And this makes sense. It's going right in order from Shavuot. And another angel, a second one followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. And another angel, a third one followed them, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast in his image and receives a mark on his forehead or upon his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. Strength is an important word in that phrase. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment, whereas in our Haftorah we were talking about smoke that was part of praise and part of worship, this is a different kind of smoke. The smoke of torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day and night, those who worship the beast in his image and whoever receives the mark of his name. What is this torment to the disobedient assembly of the beast? Well, to those who do not obey the word of Adonai, let's review this passage concerning Shavuot at Sinai, and it's quoted in Deuteronomy 5:22. It says, These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain from the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick gloom with a great voice, and he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And it came about when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, that you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. And you said, Behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We have seen today that God speaks with man, yet he lives. Now then, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer, then we shall die. For who is there of all flesh who has heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire as we have and lived? Go near and hear all that the Lord our God says. Then speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and we will do it. Hear it is doing it. The word of Adonai, in fact, if we broke that down, you can actually see every single festival at the mountain of Shavuot. He will use key words that will point you all the way from Pesach to Sukkot, and that shows you that the Spirit of the Lord coming up through that middle lamp feeds each festival. The word of Adonai came to Shavuot through consuming fire, and the only way for the righteous assembly to survive was to obey those commandments. They said, we can't live. It's too strong. It's too heavy. The angel of Revelation 14 continues on, only now the obedience to the commandments through the agency of Moses. Remember, they said to Moses, you go. We can't take it. Now it is replaced with faith in Yeshua as the mediator of the covenant. It says, here's the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Yeshua. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow with them. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud. And sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. And he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. This first sickle refers to the feast of Shavuot, the giving of the commandments, the first fruits of the wheat harvest which is reaped and waved before Adonai. And he also talks about their labors and their deeds. This also we connect with Shavuot, because which book do we read at Shavuot? Shout it out when you know it. Which book do we read at Shavuot? Ruth, good. We read Ruth at Shavuot. Why? Because we have to work for Shavuot. We have to work for it. She worked from the first fruits of the barley harvest at Chag HaMatzah all the way up to Shavuot. It's the time of the greatest labor, because in that period of time, we have all this stuff coming in, all this fruit coming in. At Shavuot, you still got to thresh the barley out now that it's in. You have the first fruits of the wheat, which must be harvested in, threshed, stored, and so forth. You have the grape harvest that begins to come in. The fruit-bearing trees begin to ripen. The vegetables and so forth begin to come up. So it's the time of our greatest labor at Shavuot. And we have to work for it. Shavuot will not come easily to you. If it came easily, you didn't do it right. Shavuot is a time of work. See, we rested in Yeshua's work at Pesach. There was nothing we could add to that because he was the lamb. But between Chag HaMatzah and Shavuot, you're going to get a little sweaty because it's harvest time. We have to work for Shavuot the same way that Ruth did. It said she would hardly take a break in the heat of the day. She just worked and worked and worked and worked on that harvest. But her deeds followed her from the first fruits of the barley harvest to the first fruits of the wheat harvest at Shavuot. And after that, then she rested in Boaz, her Messiah husband. That's what he was to her. So in the same way, at this Shavuot of Revelation that we've been reading about, those who are faithful to Yeshua, like Ruth, are told to rest in him now. For their deeds of obedience, it says, have followed them into this season of tribulations for the disobedient. And remember, the obedient are not harmed by the fires of Shavuot. It is the disobedient who are consumed. And now we have another angel. Another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar. And he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. And the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. The angels of this heavenly sanctuary continue to follow the order of the festivals on the disobedient of the earth. If you haven't read the complete Torah portion of Tetzaveh, you're going to see additional connections with the practice of consecrating the priesthood and the altars, if you'll match it up with this book in Revelation, or this chapter. The other angel has another sickle that is released at Shavuot, but this one is a sickle for grapes instead of wheat. And remember, at Sukkot, we are to celebrate after we have received the wheat in from the threshing floor and the wine from the wine vats and the wine presses, right? So this period between Shavuot and Sukkot is going to be a very busy time as well. However, at the time you would think we would be very, very busy with this wheat and this grape harvest, at this particular one, in a future time, instead of working, we are told, like Ruth, rest. Why? Because this particular harvest between Shavuot and Sukkot is not going to be considered one of blessing on the earth. This is different. This is a time of judgment, seasons of judgment. And we were clued in previously when it was told about the one who receives the mark of the beast, that he will also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. The fires of Shavuot will burn the disobedient. It will burn them through the wheat harvest and through the grape harvest that connects Shavuot to Sukkot, because that is the time when we are told to bring in those first fruits from the threshing floor and the winepress. Because they are unclean in their disobedience, it says these wine presses are located outside the holy city. You know, this crushing of the grapes that takes place on the disobedient is not going to defile that holy mountain, which Ezekiel said we had to maintain in holiness. Let's read some more about this mystery city called Babylon, who is going to drink the wine cup of Adonai's wrath. In Revelation 16, you may not even have to flip the page. Revelation 16:17, it says, "And the seventh angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, 'It is done.' And there were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. And the great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe." How many of you know the spirit of Babylon is hovering over Jerusalem at this moment? How many, we call them quarters, but what are the 3 dominant parts of Jerusalem? When you speak of an area of Jerusalem, there's the Christian section, there's the Muslim section, and there's the Jewish section. There are all sorts of spirits over Jerusalem. But these things have to be cleaned up. There are even things in Judaism that are going to have to be cleaned up. Number one, they're going to have to look on the one whom they've pierced and mourn over him. Christianity is going to have to look at its festival seasons and humble themselves from the idolatry that they've embraced in the name of Yeshua, who never asked them to do that. He said, "Obey my creation gospel. Don't make up your own stuff." And we won't even get into Islam. Not on the Sabbath. But when Babylon, this stuff, that's the best way I can describe it, this stuff of Babylon, these spirits, this iniquity is vanquished. It says the great city is split into 3 parts. And that does not mean that it will continue to be Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. What that means is the 3 pilgrimage festivals will be restored to their original places. Those are the 3 parts. The festivals of Yeshua, the unleavened bread, Shavuot, and Sukkot. In fact, it says at the same time the cities of the nations fall as well as their mountains. When we know these symbols, we understand what it is telling us, as is that the festivals, the counterfeit festivals of the nations will fall with this earthquake. The calendars of the nations that differentiate between what God told us to do and what they have chosen to do, it will fall. It will no longer be found. Those calendars will be done away with. And the commandments represented by the mountains, any commandment that is not of Adonai, whether you found it in the Talmud or the Book of the Dead, I don't care where you found it, it's going to go away. We won't be able to find it anymore. We will only find those commandments that grow out of the giving of the Torah. The creation week. An earthquake occurs that is going to start to cleanse this city that has been defiled by the pagan nations and by people who believe that they are serving Adonai but continuing to do pagan things, who are continuing to hate their brothers, who are continuing to do violence, who are continuing to pray to idols, who continue to depart from the calendar of Adonai. Earthquakes occur, the way I understand it, to relieve stress in the earth. The pressure builds up over time, and eventually the stress, the tzara, the tribulation of that plate has to be relieved, and therefore an earthquake occurs and it releases the pressure. Every act that departs from the Torah of Adonai, every commandment we keep that is not His, that He told us not to do, every calendar day that we observe that is contrary to His, anything that we do that departs from Yeshua's gospel builds up stress and tribulation in this earth. And it is going to take a mighty earthquake to relieve us of that stress, because there's a lot of junk going on. A day is coming when the greatest earthquake in the history of this earth is going to relieve the stress exerted by a twisted worship system and twisted scriptures. Does this earthquake occur at Yom Teruah? Possibly. It's a possibility. It says if Babylon is remembered, then that zikaron, that word remembrance, hints to you at the feast of Yom Teruah, because that's that spirit of power, the day of blowing for remembrance that follows Shavuot. The blowing of trumpets duplicates not just the movement of the wind or the spirits, it represents vibrations. And that's what's going on in an earthquake. It is vibrating very quickly, very powerfully, which we draw from that fifth day of creation, the spirit of power, the spirit of Gevurah. All I know is that I want to know the times and the seasons. I want to know what time it is. I do want to know what season it is, so that those vibrations from the heavenly bowls and the heavenly trumpets occur when I am already safe in a holy space, which is called obedience. It's a holy place called the Sabbaths and the festivals of Adonai and His Son Yeshua. Like the priests of Israel, I want to be consecrated 7 days. I want a full consecration. The 7 festival days, the 7 days of creation, especially the Sabbaths. I want to gather, I want to live in the clouds of obedience in the presence of Adonai. I want more than just my head in the clouds. I want my whole body there. Because wherever the body is, there the birds will gather. If you want to understand the tabernacle, if you want to understand the temple, begin with the first oracles of creation. If you want to understand the book of Revelation, begin with the first oracles of creation. They're teaching you. If you want divine protection for yourself and for your children in this generation, then teach your children every day the first oracles of creation. That's the best thing you can do when they rise up in the morning, when they lie down, when you drive them to school, when you drive them home, when you're going to Walmart, whatever you're doing. Teach your children the first oracles of creation, because as you teach them the first oracles of creation, you will teach them the 7 festivals of the Messiah, and you will teach them their protection, their safe haven, their gathering together to Yeshua on its proper season, its proper day. Your children must see that you love the festivals of Adonai. Your children must see that you love the Sabbaths of Adonai. You cannot love Sukkot without loving His Sabbaths. They have to see that love. They have to see you not only love the gospel, but obey it as well. I can say I love you all I want, but if I don't do anything, I will never really convince you that I love you. I could be committing adultery and saying I love you, couldn't I? So my saying and my doing, my hearing and my doing, it must all come together. Your children have to see you obey the gospel of creation between day 1 at Pesach and day 7 of Sukkot. You must esteem, as the liturgy says, your Sabbaths and your festivals above all. Above all. My Sabbaths you shall keep, because this is Yeshua. That's how you teach them about Yeshua. Let's close this out with a reading from Revelation. Revelation 1. And this is written to the 7 festival assemblies. And for us at this point, we are preparing for the first day, for Pesach. It says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet saying, write in a book what you see and send it to the 7 assemblies. And I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me. I skipped up to verse 12. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the middle of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to the feet, and girded across his breast with a golden girdle. And his head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow. And his eyes were like a flame of fire, and his feet like burnished bronze, when it has been caused to glow in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters, upper and lower fires, upper and lower waters. And in his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun, shining in its strength. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as a dead man. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying, Do not be afraid. I am the first, I am Pesach, and I am the last, I am Sukkot, and the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. Write therefore the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall take place after these things. As for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 assemblies, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 assemblies. You see, the menorah is the festivals of the Messiah. It is those 7 gatherings together. So let's hear, between now and Pesach, we have some things to think about. If he is going to draw us forth from chaos on that first festival day, there will be some trouble. There will be some things to go through. There will be some darkness. But don't forget, the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters. Yeshua gave us some warnings. For each festival, there is something we should be warned of. We should guard ourselves. And here is what he says concerning in Revelation 2:4. He's talking to the assembly of Ephesus, which corresponds to Pesach. And he says, I have this against you, that you've left your first love. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, and repent, do the deeds you did at first, or else I am coming to you, and I will remove your lampstand out of its place unless you repent. Can you imagine having Passover broken out of your life? He says, remember the way you approached it when you followed me at first, when I was your first love, when you trusted me and you followed me in the wilderness, and your first Passover was something glorious. And you could not believe how you understood Messiah better through all the emblems of the Passover. He says, go back to that or you're in trouble. If you approach my Passover apart from love, apart from that fire that you had at the beginning, apart from that enthusiasm, he says, I am coming to you and I will remove your lampstand out of its place unless you repent. You want to keep Passover? You better love it. And nobody can do that for you. You have to do it in here. You have to stir up that gift that is in you. If you have to get on your knees, if you have to get on your face, if you have to run around your house 7 times a day to awaken that emotion, that first love, you do whatever it takes or you will lose it. It says in Revelation 2:9, to the second assembly, I know your tribulation and I know your poverty, but you're rich. Do we feel like we're in tribulation? Yes. And the blasphemy by those who say they're Jews and they're not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Don't fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. There's going to be some trouble. There's going to be some chaos. But he says, my commandment to you, what you should watch for, is a spirit of fear. You have to cast that spirit of fear out of your life because, you know why? You have something to be afraid for. You're going to be tested. You're going to be thrown into prison. But what cannot accompany that testing is your fear. He says, I want you to get rid of it. Or you have lost Chag HaMatzah. You have lost that second lamp on the menorah. You will be tested, but do not fear. Do not be afraid. Revelation 2:14 says, and this is to the third assembly, but I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit acts of immorality. Thus you also have some who in the same way hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Repent, therefore, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. We know about the Nicolaitans. They changed the calendar. Immorality, adultery with other calendars that were not commanded to us. Yeshua is warning us to prepare our hearts for his Passover. Number one, by stirring up our first love in order to passionately do the deeds, the work that we did at first. And remember, that's when Ruth started work, at the first fruits of the barley harvest, right there during the Pesach season. We must prepare to assemble with others at Pesach with a fire of love for our Messiah and one another. We can't love him without loving each other. And we have to approach one another with the same fire of love that we feel for our Messiah. That's why it's an assembly. If we could do it on our own, it wouldn't be a problem, right? If you could sit in your house and just love yourself, or just love your husband, or just love your kids, it would not be an assembly. But he calls you to worship with people who might rub you the wrong way. He says, nevertheless, approach them with the same fire that you have for me. Guard your hearts. For unleavened bread, we cannot run from tribulation, and we cannot succumb to fear. Yeah, there's going to be problems. So what? We know where the holy spaces are. We know what the lamp is. We cannot fear. We have to cast out all fear. And how many are bound by fear today? How many fear the trouble of tribulation rather than just preparing their hearts for it? Because he's telling us how to prepare. Why sit there and be afraid of it? You know, and with every edition of Left Behind, get your heart more and more bent out of shape. When he says, I'm telling you not to fear. I've got it under control. We just have to be obedient. Prepare our hearts. Our eternal happiness depends upon how we are molded between tribulation and Sukkot. And remember, I said if we understood the value of the test, if we understood the value of the tribulation, we would not hate it as much as we do, because it does something eternal for us. If there were no tribulation, there would be no Sukkot. You have to have one to have the other. You will not be a golden temple vessel unless tribulation etches upon you fine things that will decorate and adorn the temple. It's that pressure that makes us ready. For the first fruits of the barley, he says we must put away our idols. We must shun every influence that tries to steal, distort, or change our Sabbaths and festivals. And this is spiritual immorality just as adultery is physical immorality. You cannot follow a different calendar. You cannot create your own seasons. He doesn't change. But the assembly of Shavuot is given a much stronger warning than these first three. Because as we've seen, that menorah of Shavuot is central to the other lamps. The Spirit of Adonai feeds those other lamps of wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, and reverence. And Shavuot, as we just saw, is a turning point of tribulation to the world. It's written to an assembly called Thyatira, which means odor of affliction. We only thought the tribulation was bad till we get to Shavuot. And then it really starts. We thought we had trouble, but now we have affliction. Shavuot is the point in the world when bad turns to worse, and afflictions for the disobedient become torment. We must look to each Shavuot with an expectancy of once again turning our fiery creation gospel calendar to the nations. Every Shavuot, we have to understand that what he's given to us cannot be kept here. It has to go out to the nations, and we must be obedient to that. Because one day a Shavuot will come, which one we don't know, where instead of sending us out as the birds of the air to carry the gospel, what he will do is call us in. That's why those homing pigeons make wonderful sacrifices in the temple. They know where home is, and when it's time to go home, they go home and rest. They've carried the messages out. But the Shavuot will come where he says, come here. Come here. Clouds of witnesses gather in. Now just watch and learn. Rest in me. And he will gather us until the nations are under his feet at Sukkot. During that time of worst tribulation, worst trouble, blood, and so forth, we will be safe with him. Revelation 2:18 speaks to this assembly of Shavuot. And to the angel of the assembly of Thyatira write, the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire. There's our menorah. And his feet are like burnished bronze, says this, I know your deeds. That's our Shavuot. I know your love. That's our Pesach. And our faith and service and perseverance, and that your deeds of late are greater than at the first. But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray, so that they commit acts of immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. And I gave her time to repent, and she does not want to repent of her immorality. Behold, I cast her upon a bed of sickness, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation. It's not just tribulation anymore. Now it's great. Unless they repent of her deeds. And I will kill her children with pestilence, and all the assemblies will know that I am he who searches the minds and the hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your deeds. But I say to you, the rest who are in Thyatira, who do not hold this teaching, who have not known the deep things of Satan, as they call them, I place no other burden on you. Nevertheless, what you have, hold fast until I come. And he who overcomes, and he who keeps my deeds until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessels of the potter are broken to pieces, as I also have received authority from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to these assemblies. We have to look to those 7 angels, those 7 assemblies, the 7 stars of our festival days and Sabbaths, and understand the spirit of Adonai that's commanding obedience not just to the festival angels. He's commanding us to be obedient as well. The angels will obey him. The only question is, will we obey him? We have to imitate their obedience to Yeshua's gospel. We have to love one another. We have to have courage in the tests and the tribulations. We have to obey the commandments. We have to guard our hearts, and we have to guard our festivals until the end.
Welcome to Israelnet.tv.